Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to today's lunch break with the Rabbi. We are today Tuesday, February 9th, 2021. I apologize in advance. I have a little bit of a cold here. So excuse my nasal sounding. Today, we continue our discussion into the laws that are discussed in this week's Torah reading, but today we will discuss an elaborate concept, a concept which takes us through the eyes and ears of how the Torah is perceived and passed on from one generation to the next. Sorry about that. Okay, so in today's Torah reading, and in general, we know the Torah tells us there's a concept of an eye for an eye, an ear for an ear. What does that mean? Is that really so the case? Does that really happen? Was that done in biblical times? That if a person stole, they chopped off their hands, or if a person injured somebody's eye, they knocked out his eye? Is the literal meaning of the Torah meant to be the way it is? Do we really understand God's word, meaning that God should say, chop off somebody's hand, take out somebody's eye? There's a very old famous legend about the synagogue that couldn't decide what should be done by the Ten Commandments. Should they stand or should they sit? So they went to the oldest member of the congregation in some nursing home and they asked him, what's the law? What do we do? What's the custom of this congregation? Do we stand or do we sit by the Ten Commandments? And the elderly fellow asks the rabbi, what are they doing now? He says, now some stands and some sit. Those that are standing yell at those that are sitting, and those that are sitting yell at those that are standing. The elderly fellow looks at the rabbi and says, yes, that's the custom. In Judaism, we know that there are so many differences of opinions and so many variables. But which one is it? What's the correct opinion? What's the right way to do it? How do we get to so many differences of opinion? Why are there so many differences of opinion? Couldn't God just say everything straight out? And one of the most striking and odd places, especially in this week's Torah reading, where it talks about an eye for an eye, an ear for an ear, what does it really mean? But you want to hear something fascinating? Not one commentary, not one, throughout out the guy's eye, or cut off the person's arm, take away that person's limb. Not one. In all of Judaism, from the past 3,000 years, ever since the Torah was given, every single interpretation of what it means, an eye for an eye means, that you would take the value of what it means, what he was earning with both eyes, compensate at what he can earn now with only one eye, and pay the difference. And so too with the limb, whatever injury the person did. That it's a monetary compensation to be able to fix what the person is losing because of the loss that you have incurred in that person. The same idea, we know when it comes to the four kinds that we bring on Sukkot, everybody brings an esrog. In the past 3,000 years, there hasn't been one commentary to say that it means a pomegranate. Everybody says it's an esrog. Where the esrog is from, what it looks like, that's already variables. But everybody says it was an esrog. Nobody says that it was an apple. But then there are other laws in Judaism where it's up to interpretation, where so many different variables, so many different interpretations and explanations. So how does it work? Why in some cases do I have so many differences of opinion? And why in other cases do I know that this has been the law? The Talmud gives an example and says when God gave Moses the Ten Commandments and he taught him the Torah at Mount Sinai, he gave him for every single law 49 variables how it can be pure and 49 variables how it can be impure. That means the Torah was given intentionally gray with room for interpretation. But the question is why? And why are some things no interpretation? So there are certain things that we know that in Torah we received by tradition from Mount Sinai. For example, you will not find anywhere in the world a pair of tefillin that are not black. Even though it doesn't state clearly in the Torah how tefillin should be made. The Torah says tefillin should be written as a sign on your hand. You don't see anybody taking a magic marker or tattooing a sign in their hand saying they fulfilled the obligation of tefillin. Same as with a mezuzah. A mezuzah The Torah just uses the terminology, and you should inscribe it on the doorposts of your doorway. You don't see anybody spray painting it on their doorpost, some type of sign or even God's name, but everybody has a scroll, regardless of what denomination of Judaism you belong to. All people believe that's a mezuzah. There are certain things that Moses gave as tradition from Mount Sinai, which we call in Hebrew halacha lemoshe misinai, a tradition that was given from Moses on Mount Sinai. And that applies to the tefillin, that applies to the 4 kinds, that applies to also, when we talk about in this week's Torah reading, an eye for an eye. So then why are there variables? Why do we have differences of opinion? And the commentaries explain that in order for the Torah to be realistic and identified and applicable and contemporary for every time and every age, it couldn't be a black and white book. The Torah was made by God with giving the human being the ability to interact, to innovate, and to be able to make the Torah yours. What does that mean? Before God gave the Jewish people the 10 Commandments on Mount Sinai, Abram, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 tribes also studied Torah. But the Torah that they studied was nothing to do with the physical, materialistic world. The spiritual and the physical had no connection, like we've mentioned many times. Once the Torah was given on Mount Sinai, God tells the human being that you, with a finite, materialistic, selfish individual, can now indulge in a selfless, infinite book. You can now become part of an infinite wisdom. And how do you do that? Is by taking a simple verse, which seemingly doesn't make sense, seemingly sounds immoral, seemingly sounds terrible, medieval, old-fashioned, and create a contemporary application. Find its way how it means meaning to you. Find its way how you can find that it should apply to you. An interesting thing, the Talmud tells us of a phenomenal episode. An episode that happened during the time of the Talmud where there was a discussion about a certain item, what it should be. Is it kosher or non-kosher? And there was a debate in the study hall. And the debate grew so intense that one of those who tried to prove that he was correct said, I will prove with a miracle that it's happened. Because if I'm correct, let this tree bend. Let the wall of the synagogue cave in. Let a sound of heaven come out and say the halacha that I am correct. And a sound of heaven came and said, yes, the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer. With that, Rabbi Yeshua, who was the leader of the rabbinical court at the time, stood up and said, Rabbi Eliezer, you may have a sound of heaven that says you are correct. However, the Torah states that we go by majority, and majority rules against you. At that point, the Talmud says another voice of heaven came up and said, you have been victorious, my son. You have been victorious. What does that mean? What is this Talmud telling us? So I'm very perplexed. Was God with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, or was God with the opinion of the majority? And the answer is both. Because in heaven, opposites can be tolerated. Both can be correct. But in this world, in the finite world, we have to rule like one. And therefore, in the finite world, God gives the opportunity and the obligation to the majority to rule. And the majority rules according to one opinion, as long as it's within the precepts of the Torah, within the boundaries and the categories of the Torah. And the majority ruled, even though it was against Rabbi Eliezer, still in all, the majority ruled, and that was the correct one. What God was teaching and said you were victorious, meaning you have used the tools of the Torah in order to extrapolate and to come about to the truth the way it is in this world. The truth the way it is in the world above is maybe different. Truth is consistent, but it is also dependent where it may be. What I enjoy may be true to me, but it may not be something enjoyable to yourself. So truth is consistent wherever it is, but also the circumstances may change what that truth may be. Same ideas with the arguments that exists within the Talmud. There's different discussions. And the Talmud tells us they are both correct. Because each one in its own element is correct. Each one in his own idea, each one in his way of looking at the world is correct. If I look through a certain type of tinted glasses, I will see the color outside one way. And if I look through a different color glasses, I'll see outside in a different way. Does it mean that the outside changed colors? Absolutely not. It's the way I perceive it. What did God do? By making the Torah great, by allowing the rabbis and allowing us as students of the Torah to appreciate and study the Torah and learn the Torah, he had allowed us to internalize it and own the Torah and own the words we say, that we become part and parcel of the infinite wisdom of God. And here it goes even a step further. What makes the Torah personal? What makes Judaism, godliness, personal, spirituality personal to me is the very fact that I can innovate within it. The very fact that I can find my circumstance, my situation within the Torah, that becomes mine. As the Talmud says, anything a new student innovates within the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai. And as long as we use the precepts and we don't make it up and we don't change, God forbid, what it says in the Torah, and we continue to indulge and we continue to innovate within those teachings and applying them to contemporary applications, we become part of the traditions of the Torah that have been passed down and part of that chain reaction, telling us that an eye for an eye does not really mean an eye for an eye, means its monetary application. It's not only the rabbis back then that innovated, but every single one of us are part of that chain of tradition that passes out that line of understanding and appreciation to what the Torah is about. But it takes it even a step further. Every single one of us can look within ourselves to be able to see how we can advance and we can become better. So many times we start to look to outside influences to see what does it mean for us and how we can become a different and how we can change and how we can affect ourselves and our lives. But in truth, the biggest lesson and the most we can learn is from within ourselves, from within the Torah, from what we have already for 3,000 years. God has given us the tools and the ingredients that we can create within ourselves a stimulation, an excitement, and a bond with infinite. We can motivate within ourselves, innovate within ourselves. And when we're feeling down and maybe not interested, we shouldn't have to look to outside sources, but only deep within ourselves to realize and appreciate the gift that God has given us. And that gift is our soul. That gift is our ability to connect with the infinite. To study Torah. Look in what the Torah has to teach us. Look into the words of the Torah, the infinite wisdom that God has given us. It can help us explore, unseal, and realize our greatest potential. Thank you for joining me today. Wishing you the very best for a wonderful day. Tonight, we have Journey of the Souls on our Zoom class, continuing the JLI class number 2, and that is at 7:30 p.m. on Zoom. Contact me for details and information. Also, tomorrow, join us again for Lunch Break with the Rabbi at 1 p.m. Have a great day.